The stadium held 80,000 people, and every single one of them was screaming. Liam Cooper had just lifted the World Cup above his head, the gold catching the floodlights his jersey soaked through with sweat and tears. Every camera in the world was pointed at him. And then he ran, not toward the press pit, not toward his teammates, but straight to the upper stands, where an old man in a plain gray jacket was already crying before Liam even reached him. They held each other for a long time. What no one in that stadium knew was that 18 years earlier, Ryan Cooper had been a janitor working a night shift at an airport when he found an abandoned stroller with no note, no name, and no one coming back for it. Ryan Cooper was not the kind of man people remembered. He was 34 years old, white, quietly built, with the kind of face that blended into any crowd, forgettable in the way that honest, unremarkable men often are. He worked the night shift at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, pushing a wide mop across floors that never stayed clean, emptying bins that filled back up before he reached the end of the terminal. He wore a gray uniform with his name stitched above the left pocket, and most nights he moved through the building like a ghost, invisible to the travelers rushing past him with their roller bags and boarding passes and somewhere important to be. He had been doing this job for 6 years, not because he loved it, but because it was steady, and steady was something Ryan had learned to value above almost everything else. He paid his rent on time. He kept his truck running. He showed up. Those were the 3 things he could say about himself without hesitation, and on most nights that felt like enough. He was not an unhappy man. He was simply a man who had learned to keep his expectations close to the ground, where they were less likely to fall far. But there was one thing Ryan could not fix with steadiness, and it had taken him years to stop trying. He and his wife, Sandra, had spent the better part of their late 20s trying to start a family. They went through the appointments, the treatments, the long silences on the drive home from the clinic. Eventually, the doctors gave them a word for it, a clean clinical word that explained everything and solved nothing. Infertile. Ryan had sat with that word for a long time. Sandra had not been able to sit with it at all. She left 2 years after the diagnosis, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet exhaustion that was harder to argue against. She told him she needed a different life. He told her he understood. He was not sure he did, but he let her go anyway. By the time Ryan was 34, he had stopped thinking about children the way a man stops thinking about a door that is locked and always will be. It was not grief anymore. It was just a closed room in his life, and he had learned to walk past it without looking in. Some nights, working the long, empty stretch of Concourse B after midnight, he would see a family asleep across a row of gate chairs, a parent with a jacket draped over someone smaller, and he would look for exactly 1 second before moving on. 1 second was the rule he had made for himself without knowing he had made it. That was where things stood on the night everything changed. It was a Tuesday in November, just past 2 in the morning. The terminal was nearly empty. A few late arrivals drifting toward baggage claim, a couple of gate agents finishing their paperwork. The usual quiet that settled over the airport in the hours between the last departure and the first arrival. Ryan was working the far end of Concourse B, which was the stretch nobody wanted because it was long and poorly lit, and the vending machines there had been broken for 3 weeks. He was almost done with his section when he noticed something near gate B14, a stroller. Parked against the wall beside a row of plastic seats, slightly angled as if someone had pushed it there in a hurry and meant to come back. Ryan's first thought was that someone had forgotten it. He looked around for a parent, a guardian, anyone. The gate area was empty. He walked closer, and that was when he heard a sound so small, he almost dismissed it as the ventilation system. But it wasn't the ventilation system. It was breathing. Small, steady breathing coming from inside the stroller beneath a folded blanket. Ryan stood very still for a moment. Then he crouched down and pulled the blanket back just enough to see. A baby, A newborn by the look of it, small enough to fit in both of his hands, dark-haired eyes closed, breathing with that deep unconscious calm that only very young things have. There was no diaper bag, no note pinned to the blanket, no identification of any kind attached to the stroller itself. Just the baby, alone in an airport terminal at 2 a.m, with no one around and no one coming. Ryan did not pick the baby up. He pulled out his radio and called it in. Within 15 minutes, the gate area was crowded with airport security, 2 officers from Atlanta PD, and a supervisor from Child Protective Services, who had been on call and arrived looking like she had dressed in the dark. They worked quickly and professionally. They checked the stroller, photographed the area, pulled the security footage from the cameras covering the gate. Ryan stood off to the side and answered their questions as clearly as he could. He had been in this section of the terminal since approximately 1:45. He had not seen anyone near the stroller before he discovered it. He had not touched the baby or moved the stroller. Yes, he was certain there had been no one else in the gate area. Yes, he was sure. The CPS supervisor. A woman named Diane wrapped the baby in a fresh blanket from her back and held him with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. She told Ryan he had done the right thing, calling it in immediately. Ryan nodded. He watched them work, and he stayed until they told him there was nothing more he could do, and then he went back to finish his section, because his shift was not over, and he was the kind of man who finished what he started. But he thought about the baby for the rest of the night. He thought about it on the drive home in the gray early morning light. He thought about it when he got into bed and stared at the ceiling and could not sleep. There was something about the image that would not leave him. Not the vulnerability of it exactly, but the silence. The way the baby had been lying there completely unaware of what had just happened, unaware of what had just been decided about his life by someone who was supposed to love him more than anything. Ryan had seen a lot of things discarded in airport terminals over 6 years. Lost phones, forgotten luggage, a woman's wedding ring once sitting on the edge of a sink in the men's restroom. He had turned all of it in without a second thought. This was different, and he knew it, and he did not entirely understand why. The police investigation ran for 2 weeks. Ryan followed it the way civilians follow things they are not supposed to be following, through the small updates that filtered back to him through the airport grapevine, through a single brief conversation with one of the officers, who came back to re-examine the camera angles. No mother was found. No father. No family member came forward. The stroller had been purchased second-hand and could not be traced. The baby had been healthy, full-term, no medical complications. He was placed in the county foster system, while the case remained technically open, which everyone understood was another way of saying it would not be solved. Ryan had no logical reason to keep thinking about any of this. It was not his situation. It was not his responsibility. He had done exactly what he was supposed to do. He had reported it. He had cooperated, and he had stepped back. That was the correct version of events, and he knew it. He called Diane at Child Protective Services on a Thursday afternoon, 12 days after the discovery. He told himself he was just checking in. She told him the baby was healthy, in a licensed foster home, doing fine. Ryan thanked her and hung up. He sat at his kitchen table for a while looking at the wall. Then he called back and asked what the process was for someone who wanted to be considered as a placement. The process, it turned out, was substantial. There were background checks and home assessments and training requirements and interviews and waiting periods. There were forms that asked about his income, his living situation, his support network, his history. Ryan filled out every one of them. He told the caseworker the truth about his income, which was not large, and the truth about his apartment, which was clean and stable, but small. He told them about Sandra, about the divorce, about the infertility diagnosis. He answered every question directly, and without trying to present himself as something he was not. He was a janitor. He was divorced. He was 34 years old, and he lived alone. and he made $31,000 a year, and he had no family nearby and no college degree. He knew how it looked on paper. What he could not write on any form was why. Why this baby? Why now? Why him? He had tried to find a clean explanation for it and kept coming up short. The best he could say was that he had looked into that stroller and seen something he recognized, not the baby specifically, but the situation. A person left somewhere quietly with no explanation, with no one coming back. Ryan had not been abandoned as a child. His life had not been dramatic, but he understood, in some way. He couldn't entirely explain what it meant to exist in a space that other people moved through without stopping. He had been that in his own marriage. He had been that in this airport for 6 years. He was not going to walk past that stroller again in his mind and keep pretending he hadn't seen it. The process took 4 months. There were setbacks, a second home visit, an additional financial review, a delay because one of his references had moved, and taken 2 weeks to respond. Ryan waded through all of it. He did not push. He just stayed ready. He repainted the second bedroom during the waiting period, a pale yellow he had chosen from a hardware store sample card, standing in the aisle for longer than was probably reasonable, trying to pick a color that felt like a beginning. The approval came on a Wednesday morning by phone. Ryan was in the parking lot of a grocery store when Diane called. She told him the placement had been approved. She told him the baby was 7 months old now and doing well. She told him the next step was a series of supervised visits before full custody transferred. Ryan sat in his truck in that parking lot for a long time after the call ended. He was not crying. He was just sitting there, very still, looking at nothing, feeling the weight of what he had just agreed to carry. He named the baby Liam. He had thought about it for weeks, and it was the only name that felt right. Not after anyone, not for any particular reason. Just a name that sounded like someone who had not yet decided what kind of person he was going to be. Liam Cooper. Ryan said it out loud a few times in the apartment before the first custody transfer, just to hear how it sounded in a quiet room. The first night alone with Liam was the longest night of Ryan's life. Not because anything went wrong, but because everything was suddenly real in a way that paperwork and supervision visits had not prepared him for. He sat in the second-hand rocking chair he had found at a thrift store and placed in the corner of the small second bedroom, and he held this baby, who was not his by blood and was entirely his by choice. And he thought about all the ways he could fail at this. The list was long. He let himself look at the whole list, and then he set it aside and he rocked, and eventually the apartment got quiet in a way that felt different from before, fuller somehow even in the silence. Ryan did not tell Liam he was adopted in those early years. Not because he planned to hide it forever, but because there was no version of that conversation that made sense to a child who was still learning to walk, and then to talk, and then to ask the kind of simple, enormous questions that small children ask without knowing how much weight they carry. Ryan kept the paperwork in a locked box in the closet. He kept a notebook, not a formal journal, just a plain black notebook he had bought at a drugstore, where he wrote down things he wanted to remember. The night he found the stroller. The 4 months of waiting. The way the apartment felt different after Liam came home. He wrote it for himself, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew he was also writing it for Liam. For the day when the question finally came, and he would need more than just words to answer it. That day was further off than Ryan knew, and the distance between that quiet apartment and the world Liam was going to grow into was greater than either of them could imagine on the night Ryan first brought him home, and the city moved on outside the window, indifferent and enormous, while the two of them sat in the dark and learned each other's breathing. Liam grew up fast the way boys do when they have only one parent, and that parent works nights. He learned early to set his own alarm to heat his own meals, to occupy himself in the hours between school and the time Ryan's truck pulled into the lot outside their apartment. He was not a neglected child. Ryan made sure of that, rearranging shifts, when he could trading hours with coworkers, showing up to things that mattered, even when he had been awake for 20 hours straight. But Liam understood in the practical way that children of single working parents always understand that there were limits to what one person could hold together alone, and he did not push against those limits. He worked around them instead. What Liam pushed against was everything else. He was restless in the way that athletically gifted boys often are: too much energy for small spaces, too much speed for hallways, and classrooms always slightly ahead of wherever he was supposed to be. By the time he was 8 years old, the only thing that reliably slowed him down was a soccer ball. He had found one in the apartment complex's lost and found bin, deflated and scuffed, and Ryan had pumped it up with a needle borrowed from a neighbor. That was how it started, the two of them in the narrow strip of grass behind the building. Ryan still in his work clothes, kicking the ball back and forth in the last hour of evening light before his shift began. Ryan had never played soccer in his life. He learned alongside Liam, watching videos on his phone during breaks at the airport, practicing basic footwork alone in the parking lot, during slow nights, showing up the next evening to demonstrate whatever he had figured out. He was not a natural. He was slow, and his technique was clumsy, and Liam caught up to him and then surpassed him within about 6 months. But Ryan kept showing up to those sessions in the grass, because showing up was the thing he knew how to do, and because the look on Liam's face during those hours, focused, alive, lit up in a way that nothing else seemed to light him, was a thing Ryan was not willing to give up. On the evenings when Ryan had to leave for his shift before they finished, Liam would keep practicing alone in the dark until the building's exterior lights clicked off automatically, and there was nothing left to see by. The money was always tight. Ryan had taken on a second job doing early morning cleaning at a downtown office building, which meant some weeks he was working 18 hours a day and sleeping in the truck between shifts. He did not talk about the money directly with Liam, but Liam was not oblivious. He saw the way Ryan studied the receipt at the grocery store, the way the heat in the apartment ran low in January, the way Ryan's boots were held together with electrical tape for almost a full winter before he replaced them. When a spot opened up on a local youth league team, Liam told Ryan he didn't need to sign up, that it was fine, that the fees weren't worth it. Ryan signed him up anyway. He paid the registration fee in cash in 2 installments and said nothing about it to Liam, other than that practice was on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and Ryan would be there to pick him up. At the league, Liam was immediately out of place, not because he lacked ability, but because he had too much of it and no formal training to channel it. He was faster than the other players and had better instincts, but he played like someone who had only ever learned in a parking lot, improvised, impulsive, occasionally brilliant, frequently undisciplined. The coaches noticed him quickly. So did the other parents, who noticed something else: that Liam was black, and that the quiet white man standing alone at the edge of the field, watching every minute of every game, was apparently his father. Ryan was aware of the looks. He had been aware of them since Liam was small, since the grocery store, and the pediatrician's office, and the parent-teacher conferences, where people's eyes moved from Ryan to Liam and back again, with a particular kind of recalibration that Ryan had learned to recognize without acknowledging. He never addressed it directly with Liam. He did not think it was his place to tell Liam what to make of the world's confusion. He just kept showing up, standing at the edge of the field in his work jacket, watching his son play. There were harder moments beneath the surface of those steady years. One evening when Liam was around 11, a kid on the opposing team said something to him. During a match, Ryan was too far away to hear the words, but he saw Liam's face change and watched him walk off the field without being substituted, which was something Liam had never done before. Ryan found him sitting behind the equipment shed at the far end of the complex, knees up, staring at the ground. Ryan sat down beside him and did not ask what happened. He just sat there. After a while, Liam said quietly that some kids had been asking him why his dad looked like that. Ryan asked what he had told them. Liam said he had told them it was none of their business. Ryan said that was the right answer. They sat behind the shed for another few minutes, and then walked back to the field together, and Liam finished the match. Those years were the steadiest of Ryan's life. Not easy, steady. There was a difference. He was tired most of the time, managing on 5 or 6 hours of sleep, his body operating on the accumulated debt of years of night work. But Liam was thriving in the way that Ryan had quietly, privately hoped for, without ever letting himself believe in completely. The apartment was small, and the money was short, and Ryan's social life had essentially ceased to exist. But none of that felt like sacrifice in the way that sacrifice is supposed to feel. It just felt like his life. He had chosen it. He would choose it again. Then Liam turned 15, and things broke open in a way Ryan had never prepared for. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, when Ryan was sleeping after a double shift. Liam was alone in the apartment, which was normal, and had no reason to go into Ryan's closet, which was also where Ryan stored extra blankets in a box on the upper shelf. The plain black notebook was not in a locked box. Ryan had moved it years ago after the lock on the original box broke, intending to find a replacement, and never quite getting around to it. The notebook was sitting in a shoebox on the closet shelf alongside the adoption paperwork, the original case file, a photograph of the stroller taken by airport security, and a copy of the court order finalizing the custody arrangement. Liam was not looking for any of this. He was looking for a blanket. He found the shoebox instead. Ryan woke up 2 hours later to a quiet apartment, which immediately felt wrong. Liam was usually the loudest thing in any space he occupied. Some music playing something, cooking the particular restless energy of a 15-year-old who could not sit still. The silence was wrong. Ryan found Liam sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of him, and the rest of the documents spread out beside it. He had clearly been sitting there for a long time. His face was the face of someone who had already moved through the first shock and was now somewhere further in, somewhere colder and more deliberate. Ryan sat down across from him. He did not try to explain immediately. He looked at the documents, then at Liam, and understood that whatever came next, it was going to be a different kind of conversation than anything they had had before. "You found me in a stroller," Liam said. His voice was flat, not a question. "Yes," Ryan said, "and you never told me." Ryan did not make excuses. He told Liam the truth directly, that he had intended to tell him that he had written everything down in that notebook, specifically, so that Liam would have the full story one day, and that he had been waiting for a moment that never seemed to arrive cleanly, and that he understood how that sounded and knew it was not good enough. He said he was sorry. He said it clearly, and he did not soften it. Liam listened. Then he pushed back from the table and went to his room and closed the door, and that was the last Ryan heard from him for the rest of that day. Ryan sat at the kitchen table for a long time, listening to the apartment be quiet in the way it had not been quiet in 15 years. He had known this conversation was coming for over a decade. He had just never imagined it would arrive like this, sideways through a shoebox while he was sleeping. The next morning, Liam was gone. His backpack was missing, along with a change of clothes and the cash Ryan kept in the kitchen drawer for emergencies. He had not left a note. Ryan checked his phone, no messages. He called Liam's number, and it rang out. He called 3 of Liam's teammates, 2 of his school friends, a coach who had Liam's number from the previous season. Nobody had seen him. Ryan got in his truck and drove. Covering the neighborhoods, Liam knew the park where the older boys played pickup games, the bus station downtown, the library, where Liam sometimes went to use the computers. He drove for 6 hours. He found nothing. He filed a missing person report that evening. The officer who took it was professional and unhurried, which Ryan found unbearable. He sat in that precinct and answered questions about his son, Liam's height, his build, what he had been wearing, whether there had been an argument. And he answered all of them, including the last one, honestly. Yes, there had been an argument. Ryan explained the context. The officer wrote it down without judgment, and told Ryan that in the majority of cases involving teenagers who left voluntarily following a family dispute, the kid came back within 72 hours. Ryan thanked him and drove home and sat in Liam's bedroom for a while, not touching anything, just sitting in the space that still smelled like his son. Liam was gone for 4 days. Ryan would later find out piece by piece what those 4 days had looked like. Liam had taken a bus to the other side of the city and spent the first 2 nights at the apartment of a classmate whose parents were largely absent and asked few questions. He had spent the 3rd day alone, moving between a fast food restaurant and a park, replaying everything he had read in the notebook and the documents. The anger had been the first thing a clean, hot anger at being kept from a truth that was his own. But anger at that temperature does not sustain itself for long, especially in a 15-year-old, who is also tired and hungry and sleeping on a stranger's couch. By the 3rd night, the anger had started to lose its clean edges. It happened at a convenience store near the park. Liam had gone in to buy something to eat, and while he was waiting at the register, 2 men came in with a young boy, a father and an older brother. By the look of it, the kind of low-key ordinary scene that happens in convenience stores 100 times a day and means nothing to anyone involved. The father was telling the boy something, leaning down, one hand on the boy's shoulder. The older brother was laughing at something the father said. Nothing extraordinary. Just a family moving through a Wednesday evening together, unremarkable and whole. Liam stood at the register and felt something shift in his chest. He thought about Ryan standing at the edge of every soccer field he had ever played on in that same worn jacket, watching every minute. He thought about the night he had 103 fever in 7th grade, and Ryan had sat beside his bed all night, going into work the next morning on no sleep and saying nothing about it to anyone. He thought about Ryan learning to kick a soccer ball from videos on a phone with a cracked screen so he could practice with his son in a strip of grass behind an apartment building. He thought about the notebook, not the secret it contained, but the fact that it existed. That Ryan had written it all down. That Ryan had kept it. A man who intends to lie does not write down the truth and keep it in a shoebox where his son can find it. Liam came home on the evening of the 4th day. Ryan was sitting at the kitchen table when the door opened. He had been sitting there for most of the last 4 days, in the hours when he wasn't driving or calling or filing follow-up reports with the precinct. He looked at Liam, and Liam looked at him. And neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable. Then Liam crossed the room, and Ryan stood up, and they held each other, the way they hadn't held each other, since Liam was small enough to be carried without posturing. Without qualification, just 2 people who had scared each other badly and were relieved beyond expression to be in the same room again. Liam said he was sorry. Ryan said he was the one who was sorry, and that he had been a coward about it, and that Liam deserved to have known the truth long before that Saturday afternoon. He told Liam that he had been afraid that every year that passed made the conversation feel higher stakes, and that the fear of losing Liam had made him hold the secret longer than he should have. He said he understood if Liam needed time to be angry about that. Liam said he didn't need more time. He said he had already used it. They talked for a long time that night. Not about the adoption specifically, they had said what needed to be said about that. They talked about everything else, about soccer, about what Liam wanted, about what came next. At some point, Ryan made eggs, and they ate at the kitchen table at 11 at night, like it was the most normal thing in the world, because it was. Because this was still their kitchen, and their table, and their life, and whatever had cracked in the last 4 days had not broken anything that mattered at the root. Ryan cleaned up the dishes. Liam went to bed. Ryan stood at the sink for a while, looking out the window at the parking lot below, and felt the particular exhaustion of a man who had been braced for catastrophe, and instead gotten something that hurt, but did not destroy. The apartment was quiet again, but this time the quiet was different. It was the quiet of something that had been tested and held. Something changed in Liam after he came home. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden announcement, no formal declaration of purpose. It was quieter than that. He went back to school on Monday, went back to practice on Tuesday, and came home both days and ate dinner with Ryan at the kitchen table like the 4 days had never happened. But Ryan noticed the difference. Liam was more deliberate, less impulsive. He had always played soccer with a kind of reckless, instinctive energy that was thrilling to watch and difficult to coach. After that week, he started listening differently to his coaches, to Ryan, to the older players who had been in the system longer. He still had the speed and the instincts. Now he was learning to think behind them. Ryan did not comment on the change directly. He had learned over 15 years of raising Liam that naming a thing too early could make it self-conscious and fragile. He just watched and kept showing up and said less than he normally would have. The high school team noticed the shift almost immediately. Liam had always been the most physically gifted player on the field, but he had also been the most frustrating a player who could win a game single-handedly and then lose concentration at a critical moment and make a mistake that cost one. Coaches had been working around that inconsistency for years. By his junior year, the inconsistency was mostly gone. He was still the most explosive player in any match he played, but now the explosiveness was attached to something more reliable. He was starting to become the kind of player that teams are built around rather than managed despite. College scouts appeared at his games during his junior year. Ryan started seeing unfamiliar men with clipboards and lanyards standing near the sideline, and he understood what they were there for. He did not tell Liam immediately, not wanting to add pressure to something that was already working. But Liam noticed them on his own, the way young athletes always do, and came home one evening and sat across from Ryan at the kitchen table and asked very directly whether Ryan thought it was real. Ryan said he thought it was very real. Liam nodded and went to do his homework, and Ryan sat there for a moment, feeling something he could not entirely name. Pride, certainly, but also something older and more complicated. Something that went back to a strip of grass behind an apartment building and a deflated soccer ball, and a man who did not know anything about the game but showed up every evening anyway. The scholarship offers came in his senior year. 3 universities reached out formally, and one of them, a program with a genuine pipeline to the professional level, made an offer significant enough that Liam's tuition, housing, and training costs would be covered entirely. Ryan read the offer letter 3 times at the kitchen table. He thought about the registration fees paid in cash installments, the electrical tape on his boots, the early morning office cleaning job he had worked for 9 years before finally letting it go when Liam was in middle school. He did not say any of that. He told Liam to take the offer if it was where he wanted to go. Liam said it was. Ryan said good. The first year at the university program was the hardest of Liam's athletic life. He had been the best player in every environment he had ever been in the local leagues, the high school circuit, the regional showcases. Now he was surrounded by players who had been the best in their environments too, and the adjustment was significant. He lost starting positions he had assumed were his. He made errors in training sessions that he would have been embarrassed to make 3 years earlier. He lost his temper twice during practice matches in the first semester, once badly enough that the coaching staff pulled him aside and told him directly that his reaction to failure was a problem they were watching. He called Ryan after the second incident from the hallway outside the locker room, his voice tight with the specific humiliation of a young man who has been publicly corrected in front of people he is trying to impress. Ryan listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Liam finished, Ryan was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that Liam would think about for the rest of his career. "Talent wins you games," Ryan told him. "Character wins you a life. You've got the talent handled. Figure out the other part." It was not a new idea. Ryan was not a philosopher. But there was something about hearing it in that particular moment, from that particular man, that landed differently than it might have, coming from a coach or a teammate. Ryan had no formal credential for saying it. He had no athletic background, no professional experience, nothing that would have put him in a room where people listened to him talk about competition and character. What he had was 18 years of watching Liam, and a life built entirely on showing up without recognition, and a way of saying things plainly that cut through whatever Liam had built up around the part of himself that needed to hear it. Liam did not lose his temper in a practice session again. The improvement over the following 3 years was steady, and then, in his final college season, suddenly accelerating. He finished that year as the leading scorer in his conference, was named to 2 national watch lists, and drew the attention of professional scouts in a way that moved past casual observation into formal recruitment conversations. By the time he graduated, he had signed a professional contract with a club in the top tier of the domestic league. Ryan drove 6 hours to watch the signing. He sat in the back of the room in his worn jacket and did not say much to anyone, and when it was over, he shook Liam's hand and then pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than either of them planned, and Liam laughed and said Ryan was embarrassing him, and Ryan said that was a father's right, and he intended to exercise it. The professional years were a different kind of hard. The game at that level operated at a pace and a physical intensity that made the college game feel slow by comparison, and Liam spent his first season learning that gap. The difficult way through: dropped matches, through being substituted early, through reading match reports that discussed his potential and his inconsistency in the same sentence. He was 23 years old, and playing in front of crowds that numbered in the tens of thousands, and the distance between where he was and where he needed to be felt on bad days enormous. He called Ryan less frequently than he had in college, not because the relationship had changed, but because the schedule was punishing. The travel was constant, and the emotional bandwidth required just to stay competitive left little room for long phone calls. But Ryan was at every home match. He had moved to a smaller apartment the year Liam left for college, which had freed up enough of his monthly expenses that he could afford the travel on a janitor's salary, barely by planning months in advance, and never spending money on anything he did not need. He sat in the same section every match in the same worn jacket, and Liam always knew exactly where to look when he jogged out of the tunnel before kickoff. It was not a ritual they had ever discussed or agreed upon. It had simply become true the way certain things between fathers and sons become true without being decided. There was one evening midway through Liam's second professional season that neither of them talked about much afterward, but that Ryan did not forget. Liam had just come off the worst performance of his professional career, a home match, where he had missed 2 clear chances and been substituted in the 63rd minute in front of his own crowd. Ryan was waiting for him outside the players' exit, which was not something Ryan normally did, but something had told him to stay. Liam came out looking like a man who wanted to be left alone, and Ryan fell into step beside him without saying anything, and they walked 2 blocks to a diner and sat in a booth and ordered coffee. And Ryan still did not say anything about the match. They talked about the apartment back in Atlanta, about a neighbor's dog that Ryan had been feeding, while the neighbor was traveling about nothing. When they got up to leave, Liam said quietly that he was glad Ryan had been there. Ryan said he knew that was the whole conversation. The national team call-up came when Liam was 25. It was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching closely, but it was still the kind of thing that does not feel real until the letter arrives. Liam read it in his apartment, and then called Ryan before he called anyone else. Ryan picked up on the second ring. Liam read him the relevant part of the letter. Ryan said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Well, Tuesday practice is going to feel different now." Liam laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and Ryan laughed too, and they stayed on the phone for another 40 minutes, talking about almost nothing important. The ceremony where Liam received his first national team jersey was held at the Federation's training facility. Ryan drove down the night before and stayed in a roadside motel 40 minutes from the facility, because every hotel closer was fully booked. He arrived the next morning with a small coffee from a gas station stood in the allocated family section and watched his son walk onto a stage in front of cameras and officials and Federation representatives and receive the jersey that had his name on the back. Liam found Ryan's face in the crowd from the stage, the way he had been finding it at the edge of every field since he was 8 years old, and held eye contact for just a moment before the next name was called. From that ceremony to the World Cup was 3 years. 3 years of international qualification matches, of tournaments, of building towards something that the whole country was watching. Liam was not the only important player on the team, and he did not try to be one of the things he had figured out in his professional years, was that the players who last are the ones who make the team better, rather than the ones who make themselves more visible. He was the team's most dangerous forward, and he played like a man who understood what that responsibility required, rather than what it permitted. The World Cup run lasted 5 weeks. Liam played every match. He scored in the quarterfinal, assisted the winning goal in the semifinal, and in the final broadcast, live to hundreds of millions of people, he put away the penalty kick in the 89th minute that sealed the championship. The stadium erupted. His teammates piled onto him. The noise was physical, a wall of sound that pressed against everything. Ryan watched it from his seat in the allocated family section 53 rows up from the field in his worn jacket. He had not bought anything new for the occasion. It had not occurred to him to. When the on-field celebration reached the point where the players were given a free moment before the formal trophy presentation, Liam broke away from his teammates and ran. Not toward the cameras positioned at the center of the pitch, not toward the broadcast platform where journalists were already waiting with microphones. He ran toward the stands, toward the section where he knew Ryan was sitting, and the crowd in that section parted instinctively as he reached the barrier, and Ryan came down the steps, and they met at the railing and held on to each other while the stadium continued its enormous noise around them. Ryan was crying. He was not trying to hide it. Liam's face was pressed against his shoulder, and Ryan's hand was on the back of his son's head, the way it had been when Liam was small and needed to be steadied, and neither of them moved for a long time. Later in the post-match press conference, a journalist asked Liam what was going through his mind when he stood at the penalty spot. Liam considered the question for a moment. Then he said that when he stood at the spot, he thought about the man in the family section in the worn jacket, the man who had learned to kick a soccer ball from videos on a cracked phone, who had paid league registration fees in cash installments, who had driven to every match and stood at the edge of every field, and never once asked for anything back. He said he wanted to make sure that man saw something worth all of it. He said he thought about 18 years of being chosen every single day by someone who had no obligation to choose him at all. The room was quiet after that. A few cameras flashed. Liam took a drink of water and waited for the next question. 53 rows up, Ryan Cooper sat in his worn jacket in an emptying stadium and looked out at the field, where the groundskeepers were already beginning their work. And he thought about a Tuesday night in November, a terminal at 2 a.m, a stroller parked against a wall at gate B14. He thought about a shoebox in a closet and a plain black notebook and 4 days of driving through a city looking for his son. He thought about eggs at 11 at night and a kitchen table and a parking lot outside an apartment building and a deflated soccer ball that had cost him nothing and given him everything. He was 62 years old. He had worked the night shift for most of his adult life. He had never done anything that the world would have called remarkable, and he had never needed to. The most important thing he had ever done was stop at a stroller in an empty terminal and refuse to walk away. He sat there until the stadium was almost empty, and then he stood up, put his jacket on properly, and went to find his son.